Kia ora, welcome. My name's Simon Lauber. I'm Chief Executive of the Early Childhood Council. Thank you for joining us on this recorded webinar around 20 Hours ECE. This replaces a webinar we ran that didn't work technically, and so we're releasing it this time with the presentation slides as well. I'm going to race through it. There's a lot to cover. So hopefully coming up on your screen are the slides now. And we'll just get into it. So Early Childhood Council, we are an incorporated society. We're not for profit. We are the largest early childhood incorporated society in New Zealand. We've got about half of the education and care services that are around New Zealand are our members. 845 members, there's over 1,300 centres. They've got about 9,000 staff, including nearly 6,500 qualified teachers, and they're caring and educating about 75,000 children per year. Why we've got different number of members in centres, because some of our members have groups, so they have multiple centres that they're responsible for. Now, the values we stand for are promoting and maintaining a high standard of early childhood education and care in New Zealand, and also hand in hand with that, because if you raise quality too far and you don't fund it, then actually what do you end up with? You have no access because parents can't afford it, because it's just so high quality, nobody can afford it. So hand in hand with our objective around improving quality, we have an objective around ensuring that these centres actually stay financially viable, because it's no good if you lose them. It's quite hard to set these things up. And of course, the third role we have is around advocating to government on behalf of everybody in early childhood. So working with other sector organisations, representing issues that face teachers, the operators, even children. You know, that's our wheelhouse. Thank you for coming on this webinar. And if you are a parent, if you're a teacher, or if you're someone else who's just interested, I think you'll learn something in the session. We really appreciate your engagement anyway. Okay, so this is the second session. In the first one, we covered pay parity, and I'm not going to duplicate that information in this webinar. So if you're interested in pay parity and what's not working with pay parity right now, watch the other webinar we've recorded. It's available on our website and on the Facebook group. This one we're going to cover, there's going to be a bit of a recap on how early childhood funding works, because unfortunately you kind of need to know a bit about that to understand what we're talking about here. And we'll talk about the 20 hours budget announcement this year, which has been very confusing for people and really drove having this session today. So I always quite like to share with people what we expect you to get out of this session, to try and maybe hopefully make it easier for you to get those things out of it. So number one, it'd be really good if you could understand something about early childhood funding from the session if you don't already, or if you already know quite a lot, maybe learning something a bit new about it or extending that learning a little bit more. Two, we'll talk about optional charges. So that relates to 20 hours ECE. It's timely that we do talk about that, because yeah, I'll get to why it's timely in a minute, because it's part of the 20 hours budget announcement and what kind of went wrong there. So a bit of a spotlight has been shone on 20 hours as a result, and optional charges are one of the ways services can charge fees on top of the 20 hours. And yes, of course, we'll be explaining how what was wrong with that budget 20 hours announcement and why it wouldn't have worked for for so many early childhood services. So quickly on funding. So government funds a lot of the cost of service provision for early childhood, but they don't fund everything. Here, the circle, hopefully the cursor is showing up on the video. I'm indicating the circle. In that circle or pie chart, you see 20 hours ECE funding represents more than 50% of the total funding revenue that the government passes through to early childhood services. Alongside it, other funding sources. So we've got a subsidy for children who are 2 years and over, and there is another funding subsidy for children who are under 2 years old. And then there's a very small sliver of targeted funding from the education side of things. So that's meant to go to services which are dealing with more disadvantage in their communities than others. So actually, if you look at that overall pie, the level of targeted funding is really, really small. And we know in New Zealand that there are some extreme pockets of disadvantage. So that, is actually a worry in itself, that there is such a small amount of targeted funding. Look, there is a little other circle there beside the big circle. That's the childcare subsidy. That's administered by MSD. Families have to apply for that, and it's income tested. Last year, the Labour government announced changes to the thresholds for the childcare subsidy. So more families are now eligible for the childcare subsidy. That's a good targeted funding source, but it's notoriously underutilised, partly because parents feel like applying for something from MSD is like stigmatising. Please kind of get over that. I'm sorry that they've designed a hurdle that is so unattractive to parents, but if you meet the conditions for the childcare subsidy funding, I think you should, for the sake of your children, take up the money that's available there. So that will subsidise some of the cost of childcare, depending on your income level. So that's with MSD. Overall, the giant cake of money that gets divvied up every year is $2.4 billion, okay? So we're talking a lot of money. But don't get dizzied by the figures, because actually you start to see really big sums of money, but when you divvy it up to individual services, it's not as much as you think. Actually, what our view is that the sector is chronically underfunded. They're so busy delivering services, they haven't organised to work out just how badly underfunded they are. So that's something that we need to do. That's why a funding review is something we're calling for. Now, thinking of the education money, the way it's funded to services. So it's a service funding system. So, and the services are funded based on the number of child hours they return each funding period. A funding period is quite big. It's 4 months in advance and 4 months in arrears, and the month that you submit it is kind of not covered that time. And the funding returns happen 3 times a year. So they're very big processes, covering massive swathes of time in 4-month chunks. And one of the problems with that is that anything that the service does has to be consistent over the 4-month periods. So that means that, for example, if they have problems with maintaining the number of qualified teachers they need to receive higher funding rates, that could be as arbitrary as being 1 hour short, and then they'll lose a massive amount of funding for an entire 4-month period just by being 1 hour off. There are little initiatives that try and help give them flexibility, but unfortunately the way the system is designed, you can only have one kind of funding setting for a 4-month period, and you either qualify for it or you don't. So it is a nightmare for services. So looking at this, I know this is a horrible looking diagram. It's like some kind of, chemical, thing. But this is the way the funding is kind of structured. So the amount of funding a service receives depends on what type of service they are. So then there's the types. Most early childhood services in New Zealand are in that education and care type. But there are other types too. Kindergartens, they're also centre-based, but they get different higher funding. There's play centres, kohanga, and there's home-based as well. And home-based is particularly in trouble at the moment. We're losing a lot of home-based services right now. That's cause for concern. So that's one of the ways you get funded. The others are whether or not the service is all day or sessional. That's starting to not be a very significant factor because they're all day. The third one there is whether or not the service hours are covered by 20 hours or not, because that is the premium level of funding comes through 20 hours. So that's the top concern for services. Then there are other kind of funding policy factors that come into it. So this one probably didn't used to exist, this pink kind of one. At the moment, there's this other layer that's been put on top called pay parity. And so depending on the services, what they opt to claim, they then have to pay their teachers at new higher minimum salary rates. And they have options around whether or not they pay all of their teachers based on this new pay scale, or there's an option that they only do the first 6 levels. So that's what pay parity is. Extended pay parity is where you've got all of the levels, and you have to follow those minimum salary rates. In exchange for agreeing to follow those minimum salary rates for your teachers, you get higher funding rates for your funded child hours. And therein lies the problem, really, because unfortunately the number of children or the number of child hours you have doesn't actually necessarily relate to your teaching team and how experienced they are. So the two things are not the same thing. So that's one of the problems we have with pay parity, is there are some of the services with the most qualified and experienced teachers are underfunded, considering how much higher their salary costs are under the pay parity policy. And the funding coming in from the ministry based on funded child hours, adjusted with these funded policies, is just not enough. It's creating a gap. So they still have to pay those teachers more, but the government funding is not covering the salary costs. So that's where you might be seeing your fees increasing in some services, because they've got to find the money somewhere. Okay, moving around the diagram still, age of the child, kind of broadly touched on that before. So there is a differential between children under 2 and children 2 and over. And of course, children 3 and over, because that's where 20 hours comes in. More about that soon. And the last one is the proportion of funded hours delivered by certificated teachers. So that was that old catch cry you might have heard many years ago around 100% qualified teachers. So that still exists in ECE. It's still one of the funding incentives that are there. So if your service can say that for the minimum number of regulated hours per day for those funded hours, that they have 100% qualified teachers, then they can claim that funding rate. I'm going to move on. Now, I'm just not going to stay here for too long. I just wanted to show you a funding rate table. There are rate tables all over the show. So many. It's getting so complicated for services. We're going to probably do a process soon where we select some of our members that we can see are obviously on the wrong rates, and we're just going to go to them proactively and say, hey, we see you're claiming this. Maybe you might want to consider changing your claim, because we've tried everything else. We've tried to explain some of these new policies to our members, but it's so confusing out there. And 1 minute, you know, something might be looking good, next minute it's not. And you know, these are busy people. The situation can change over a 6 to 8 month period or longer. So what might not have been a good idea 8 months ago is now pretty much the best option. So hard job for being these service operators. So just pulling through the threads from the previous slides, here we've selected, so in education, this is an education and care rate table. We are looking at all day rates here, and these are for base funding. So there's no pay parity figures built into this rate table, but there are rate tables for all the other options. You know, we could have found a sessional table. We could have found a rate table that had pay parity. There could have been a rate table that had extended pay parity. There will be a new one soon around full parity. It is pretty complicated. I don't expect you to understand it, but just so you know what services are having to deal with, this is their reality. So in the green highlighting there, we're just showing you that actually just the profile of the percentage of qualified teachers is still quite a strong driver. If you see the way it drops off, so 100% qualified teachers at 20 hours, you get $13.01 per hour per child. But if they don't have 100% qualified teachers, say they've only got, you know, say that one of those teachers wasn't available at a lunch break, they'll drop down to the next funding band, 80 to 99%. And you see that they lose a lot of money. So just for that small infraction, they would lose, you know, what is it? Nearly 73 cents per hour for 4 months, you know, is kind of crazy. But that's the difference between the funding bands. And of course, it drops off further. Okay. So the under twos have higher funding rates there, but don't let that deceive you. And it's higher than 20 hours, but you need more teachers. So, you know, if anything, that under two rate is possibly on the low side. I know it looks higher, but in terms of what your service costs are, because you need more teachers, it's not a lucrative option. You know, you can kind of intuitively, you know, as a parent, you probably can see how the truth of that. How many, you know, places can you find for under twos around your community? Not many. Now, if it was lucrative, it would be there, okay? Because when you have a system like this, which is essentially private provision with state regulation and state funding, the organisations delivering the services are very responsive to what the government will fund. And here, the government, you know, knowingly or unknowingly, are not sending those dollars to where they need to for the under twos. In a way, that was because there was a focus on trying to get children into ECE before starting school. And so the focus was 4-year-olds, you know, at least you should have had some experience in early childhood before starting school. So that's where you see things like 20 hours and 20 hours, you know, 3- and 4-year-olds. It's just a rationing decision. If they had all the money in the world, they'd make it available for all of the children, but they don't. So they had to draw the line somewhere, and they went for the older children. But it doesn't mean that the younger children don't also benefit from ECE if it's quality. Possibly need better ratios though than what's funded, and that's another issue. Okay, so I think I'm taking a bit too long at the moment, so I might need to speed up. So looking again at that early childhood funding investment. So remember, that's $2.4 billion. So, but for the 20 hours part of that cake, it's an opt-in process. They don't have to offer 20 hours, but then they wouldn't have, if we go back a slide, if you didn't have 20 hours, you'd only be having these columns here, the under 2 and 2 and overs. So remember that for 20 hours, it's 3-year-olds and older. So if you are not going to do 20 hours, then you'd be left with this 2 and over rate. And you see it is a significant reduction between the subsidy funding level and 20 hours. And the only difference is the fact that there are fee controls on 20 hours, really. So the same kind of costs go into it. So for the 20 hours, what you're entitled to is up to 6 hours per day and 20 per week. So that makes it awkward. So start to chop up your 20 hours. You've got, 6 on Monday, 6 on Tuesday, 6 on Wednesday. That's 18 hours you've left over too. Where does that go? You can't have it on the Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. It'll have to go on another day. Not the greatest flexibility for parents, and irritating for centres too, actually. Now, so one of the things around 20 hours is you cannot be charged fees for 20 hours. So when you sign that enrolment form, if there are any optional charges, they'll need to be made clear to you when you enroll. It needs to be in writing. And there are rules around what can be an optional charge or not. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So here are some examples. Hopefully you can grab a copy of this. I know it's quite hard to read on the screen. So in the center of the screen, you've got an enrolment form. That's just the ministry standard. And then you've got an example of what optional charges needs to look like in terms of, it's got to be in writing. So you see, let's start with the enrolment form there. So that's something you see when you enroll. So you fill that out. When do you enroll? Quite early on, you've got to decide, whether or not you're going to be giving that service your permission to claim the 20 hours funding. Because it's based on the child, not the place in the service. It means that, say your child could be at multiple services, you've got to choose where those 20 hours are going to be used. And you could reallocate those hours between different services. I know it's fiddly to do, but you could do it. And it's basically a declaration that the parent then signs. Potentially this is something the ministry could check. They could say, look, you've made a false declaration. If you claim something somewhere and claim something else somewhere else, that's not good. So parents, there is some liability with parents under 20 hours. You've got to be honest about your declaration, because the services will rely on that and then claim money on that basis. Ministry can check, of course. They can see where these children are enrolled. I'm not aware of any sophisticated checking happening though, but it does happen. It has happened. So look, where do your fees go? Look, it's a hard question, really. So from a service point of view, the funding, like I said, comes in 3 installments throughout the year in giant chunks of money. They're not getting drip fed this money, so they've got to do quite a lot of budgeting on, at least a 4-month basis, maybe worse though, in terms of staffing, because you couldn't actually successfully run one of these services if you made a mistake and you're basically trying to run a service at 100% qualified teachers, but then someone's going on parental leave or someone resigns. You've got to plug that gap, or else that whole service will have to change its kind of funding level. It's no good to be a service going for 100% qualified teachers and being at 98%, because you're just not at the level. You've got pretty much the same costs as a service on 100%, but you're not going to get enough money to pay those teachers. That's the reality of early childhood. So there's a lot of funding insecurity for them. So the money comes in and they are the ones who pay and employ their staff. So not just the teachers, support staff, admin staff, everything you see happening in a centre, all the property is all the service provider's obligation to take care of it. And the money that the government provides is not attached to what they then spend it on. So even though there's money for the teacher salaries in the 20 hours funding, it doesn't get hardwired so that like the teacher dollar has to go to that teacher. It is just a bulk amount of money. And then there are obligations on the service to make sure they pass on things like, pay teachers at least at the minimum rates that have been set, but also having those right ratios of adults or teachers to children in the centre at all times and reporting it. So, but here we have a problem though, because only 20 hours was meant to start to cover the full cost of the service provision. But over time, what we've seen is that it's not even covering it. And partly that's for a good reason, that services are not actually delivering 20 hours on those minimum funded ratios. They're doing better. They have more than the minimum number of teachers required. Centres are only funded on the minimum level. They're not funded anything higher than the minimum level. So if you have more teachers than required, you have to fund those additional teachers from another source. So that's one of the drivers now of a lot of the fees, is that you've got centres with better ratios than what was funded. Very common for the under twos. So the service might request you pay optional charges, and you could have optional charges. I'll cover what they can cover in a minute, but the operating costs for a service are quite tricky as well. So you've got things like the basic funding system was designed, before, in basically the 1990s. At that time, property wasn't really considered much of it wasn't really factored in. But over the last few decades, look at property prices in New Zealand. Well, that's pretty real for many centres, especially centres in Auckland. We've got some quite difficult situations going on with landlords that own the sites, and very, very high rents. So when your childcare centre or ECE centre owner is being subject to really high rent increases, they're going to pass that on to you, because there is no recognition in the government funding. It's considered like zero, basically. There's no funding stream designed for it. That means all of that property pain that we know we've all faced in New Zealand, that is probably one of the major drivers of the unaffordability of ECE. It will be probably that, I'd say, not that we know for a fact. But other things are things like CPI, so the consumer price index affecting utilities, energy, food's there as well. Salary costs, of course, so increasing, like pay parity artificially increases the salary costs. That's the plan, that's what it's supposed to do. But if the government funding doesn't match the salary increases, then again, you've got an issue of services then having to think about you in terms of fees. Now, I know I've been talking a lot about 20 hours and how you can't charge fees for the 20 hours, but you can charge fees for the hours over 20. So if you're in a situation where you have your children and you're receiving 20 hours, but you've got less than 20 hours per week that you're using, you're in that situation where the only additional fees you'd expect to see would be optional charges, But if you are in a situation where you have more than 20 hours a week, then for those additional hours after 20, there can be fees. Absolutely, there'll be fees. There'll need to be the fees to get the funding, because they're not getting funded for those hours by the government, except from the subsidy, which is, there's a small fraction of money coming in there from the subsidy. But you'll see that is the best way for the services to then cover the funding gaps that they're facing. So because you need more than 20 hours, then they will adjust the hourly rates for the hours above 20 hours to cover those costs. I think the others there are pretty self-evident. Yeah. And so, yeah, just before I move on, so that's the optional charge section. So you have to consent to it. You've got to consent to it in writing. If you've got concerns, do raise them with your service first. Please do not complain to the ministry straight off. Give the service a chance to, like, what if they made a mistake? We all make mistakes. If they've made a mistake, give them the opportunity to fix it. If they are in a situation of not complying with the funding rules and they get a licensing visit, you could be looking at your service having issues with its license. You know, ECC's view is that, you know, we need to help support these operators to make sure they do comply with the rules. That's kind of our focus. But where they don't comply with the rules, it's not as black and white as, oh my goodness, they're doing this deliberately. It is a minefield for these guys. You know, if you've got concerns, raise it with them. If they won't fix it, you know, by all means, make a complaint or check with us. But don't assume that they've got some, you know, negative agenda against you. Okay, so optional charges. On the screen, we've got what you can have an optional charge for and what you can't. Okay, and these are optional charges are requests for payments for a specific purpose. So it's got to be specific. It can't be something that's kind of amorphous that you couldn't kind of separate off. So you're allowed, those services are allowed to put in place an optional charge for things that are not covered by the minimum regulations. So they can actually put in an optional charge to start recovering the additional staffing costs. So if they're not running on, say, a 1:10 ratio for the children 3 and over, maybe they've got more teachers than that. Maybe it's only a fraction more, but there's another teacher that is not being funded basically by the government. So that teacher's salary cost could be devised as an optional charge because they only have to provide the minimum staffing for 20 hours. They don't have to do better than that. But if that's what parents want, so that's why it's optional. You don't have to pay it. If you don't pay it, then there has to be the option at the service to not have that provided. So look, services can have particular activities as optional charges. So it's a bit garbled on my screen there, but so food could be an optional charge, transport, teaching resources, excursions, sunscreen. You know, these are kinds of things that can suit an optional charge. Remember, it's only optional at the start. Once you've agreed it, it's an enforceable payment. Okay, things that are not optional charges. Just move that heading out the way. So things that are required by regulations, general contributions, things that you can't kind of separate out. Wage top-ups, you know, admin fees for 20 hours. So the last one on the list, you know, excursions that don't meet the criteria for excursions in transport. So they're basically not really legitimate excursions at all. Yeah. So like I said, if you've got concerns about your optional charges, reach out to your service first to discuss it. Okay, moving on. So budget 2023 was a big budget for ECE. Blew us away actually, and look at the dollars. So just that 20 hours extension for 2-year-olds, 1.2 billion over 4 years. So just to remind you, if you don't know the details there, so the current Labour government said that if they're re-elected this year, then in March next year, 20 hours ECE that's currently limited at 3-year-olds and above will be extended. So children who are 2 years old will become eligible for 20 hours ECE. Now their plan was to make childcare ECE more affordable for parents, and this would do exactly that. So, but of course you'd need to have a 2-year-old. You know, if your children are already over 2, you're not going to benefit from this necessarily. But think about, you know, the parents that come after you. You know, they'll benefit. Now, the other thing is, because I've had a few questions following the first time we ran this session, but just to reiterate that there is the other way parents benefit from this type of initiative. So expanding 20 hours, like I was saying at the start, there's a reason why you can't find a place for your under 2s. You know, there's a reason why you can't get your child in, you know, even when they're 2, that it gets, you know, realistically, you're starting to get quite close to age 3 before a place, you know, miraculously becomes available. That is not just a random coincidence that all of you face. That is because with this privately devised system that we have for ECE, which is regulated and funded by the government, the services are highly responsive to what government will fund, and government does not encourage the younger children's participation in ECE based on their funding. But if this change to 20 hours goes ahead, that starts to change, right? No longer do you have to be 3, you could be 2. So that is government, the dollars start to go towards the younger children. The services will respond to that by making more places available for 2-year-olds. So it's not going to happen overnight, but it will certainly happen. The participation for 2-year-olds will increase, and that means more places and more hours too. If you've only got a limited number of hours, you know, it should become a lot more possible to get 20 hours for a 2-year-old in the future. So really, really good news. But it wasn't all good news, unfortunately, with that announcement. I don't think I've got it. Yeah, so under the 20 hours announcement, initially what the government said is that parents must be allowed to enroll the children for only the 20 hours. So now that was designed to start to break down this practice in the sector, which is that you are, in the fee schedule you agree to a number of days. Now, a day may be longer than 6 hours, because remember, 20 hours has a 6-hour maximum. So depending on how many days you then have fees that are generated on top of that. And that's, in a way, how services have gotten around the funding shortfalls that are built into 20 hours. They've gone to this kind of day-based arrangement. So that enables them, so all you'd have to do is have attendance over 6 hours, and suddenly that could attract basically a compulsory fee. You know, of course you could have optional fees, but you know, you're not really going to see a lot of optional fees, I'd say. You're much more likely to see fees in the compulsory space for hours over and above 20 hours. So yeah, that was one of the things the government wanted to introduce with this extension to 20 hours, is they wanted parents to be able to just have the 20 hours. So that would mean that if you're currently on, say, 3 days a week, and you're getting 8 or 9 hours a day, you will be given the option of having 6 hours a day and not having more, if that's what you want. Okay, number 2 there, services need to start to shift to setting fees by the hour. And so then where the 20 hours are there, you'd see those would show up as $0 an hour, and then you'd be able to see hourly rates for other hours. So that's something that's in the mix still. And these hourly fees would need to be published, and they'd need to be provided to the ministry. So the ministry wants to start collecting information on fees. Okay, so the myth of 20 hours being free. So here we have, on the left-hand side, we've got it's based on a real centre, but there's many fee schedules out there. Top one is the privately owned fee schedule, and at the bottom one, we've picked out a community-based one. no real reason why we selected these two. When we were selecting the community-based one, there was a massive variety of different schedules. It was quite a lot more confusing. Private one's a little bit more comparable. But anyway, let's just have a look at this. So this kind of demonstrates the point I was just making around the change around having fees on an hourly basis versus a daily basis. So looking at the private one, you see for 2 days, full-time provision, so that's 10.5 hours, the fee for children under 3 is $192 for the 2 days. But if that service, if you use your 20 hours in that service, your fee for those 2 days goes down from 192 to 126. That's only if you've attested to the 20 hours. So that's kind of how you'd start to see 20 hours showing up. And it is kind of confusing, I'd admit. It is hard to see. You can kind of see what the difference is between the two. Yeah. And they're looking at the community-based provider. So, you know, obviously you've got the fees are a lot lower in that one. They're not necessarily always going to be lower. That this is just these are just random examples. But generally, you'd expect a community-based operation to have lower fees than a private operation. But that's, yeah, that does go the other way too. So I'm just seeing in that box, I think I've kind of covered all of those things. So yeah, so, you know, what's going on in the back of an operator's mind is how do they make sure they get enough money to pay for their costs for the week, for the month, for the year. And so that's what's driving them when they're setting these fee schedules. So as costs go up, like food or something like salary costs for teachers goes up, they budget what the increase is for the future financial period. Hopefully they've got that much time to plan for it. And then they'll adjust the fees because they can't adjust the funding from government. So if government funding is not enough, so like the 2.75% inflation adjustment, when inflation was close to 8%, well, you know, what does that mean, guys? That means you're paying for the other part of the inflation increase through fees. Because, you know, what else would happen? Where else will the money come from? It's either that or the service closes, and too many services have been closing. 200 closed in the last year. So just to recap, 20 hours extension. So what was the good news? It should mean better access to ECE for 2-year-olds if it comes in. And the main issue was around the rule that parents would be able to just get the 20 hours. So those day schedules wouldn't work anymore. And that was how the services are currently recovering a lot of their unfunded service costs. So that would have meant one or two things, really. How many services are we talking about? We would estimate that it's about 2/3 of our members would be in this situation of this 20 hours no longer would be workable for them. That's a lot. That's too many, way too many. We have problems. We have a lot of problems, but that is a really big problem if it affects that many. So if it did affect the service, they've got options. They would possibly just cut 20 hours entirely and move to a full fee paying system. That would be terrible. You know, that would be like breaking the initiative, really. No government should do that. They should definitely never put it into that situation. But the other option, of course, is that the service just sees the writing on the wall. You know, they don't want to continue without 20 hours, so they just close. And that's sadly what we see so much in the last few years. So, yeah, that is what's happening, I'm afraid, guys. We were pretty vocal. We joined other sector organisations, wrote an open letter to the government, and we even had a meeting with Associate Minister Luxton. and work through those really major concerns. We actually did have concerns around the changes to moving to hourly fees, because there's a lot of regulation and compliance in that space already, and we just wanted to know what exactly they wanted to do with that change, and why couldn't they do it through one of the existing reporting requirements that we've already got. What ECC's role is really in this space is to kind of always be saying, hang on a minute, government, you're already doing this. Why didn't you just change this or refine this? Like, if they add on so many different layers, we're in a place right now where there are just so many layers upon layer that is getting in the way of actually what they're there to do. So, you know, they're spending too much time on admin. It needs to be smarter. You know, it would go a great deal further coming up with changes like this and then actually providing the change support for the centres. But right now they just change the wording, and then every centre across New Zealand has to scramble to try and work out what's going on, why it's happening, and then they have to work out how they're going to comply. It's a scramble, and a lot of the stuff is not smart. You know, it's too many layers. But on the 19th of June this year, government decided to backtrack. So that number one that I was just showing you before around allowing parents to enroll just for the 20 hours, that is gone. That's off the table now. Good thing too, because potentially you would have had, you know, 2/3 of centres would have become unsustainable with that arrangement. So, you know, trouble was coming if they didn't. Like, it's a great goal to have, but what it has really done is it has shone a massive spotlight on 20 hours for our operators. It has reminded them that something that's been around since 2007 actually doesn't work so well anymore, because they've got much higher costs than they had back then. And when government tried to do this to force centres to just work within the 20 hours, it just showed them, hey, 20 hours is not actually covering our costs anymore. So we need to review the funding system. We need to make sure that things that say that they're meant to cover the full costs, that's the deal. On the other side, you get no fees for 20 hours. Centres meant to get fully funded money from the government for those costs. Well, that's not happening. That's what we're saying. And now we realise that a lot more keenly, because they were trying to make that change, and it highlighted it. So even though that condition is gone, you know, it's really just exposed a massive problem with 20 hours that needs to be fixed. So that undermines current 20 hours. I won't go over the things that you know that are still there. I've already kind of covered that. Now, just a bit of a sense of where we're at. Now, I know that this is a timeline. It looks a bit busy. You see, maybe let your eye drift down to the blue blob. So that's the election in October. And then back up from there, there's the line from the webinar, yesterday's date. And you see, you know, the dropping the 20 hours conditions, that's quite recent. Budget's not that far back. But look, the yellow ones. So leading up to budget, the sector was very, very involved in a pay parity funding review consultation. And you'll see that up in the right corner there, the yellow ones, we still don't know what's going to happen with the pay parity funding review. We don't know what the outcome of the consultation is. And once decisions are made, how long will it take to design a new system? So that's potentially 12 to 18 months minimum. Now, in the meantime, we have a pay parity funding regime that ECC has concerns with, because it encourages services to not employ the most experienced teachers. You know, so it needs to be fixed. We were quite happy to see the ministry's proposal in the funding review to get rid of the discrimination, but actually stuff does need to change. We do have a discriminatory system at the moment, right now. So them saying that they would change it and get rid of it is great, but unfortunately that's only half of the equation. They also actually need to get rid of it. And if there's question marks around that actually happening, will it happen and when will it happen? You know, we're in quite an uncertain process, and will we even find out by the election? We just don't know. So that is a massive issue. And like I said, tune into the pay parity webinar if you want to hear more about pay parity. It is such a complicated, fraught area. And I don't think we'd be here talking to you now about 20 hours if it wasn't for the massive disruption that that pay parity policy has done. The basic gist of it is, you know, requiring all the services to follow a new pay scale, but then not funding it and not being transparent about that. So services are kind of trapped into coming onto policies that they can't afford. And then unwittingly, that means you guys having more fees, and it means us losing our centres. They just close because they just get to a crisis point. So on there, we've got, you know, the 20 hours extension. So that's March next year. It hasn't come in yet, in case you're wondering. And I did mention the income thresholds having changed. Yeah, and the pink ones are the pay parity things, which is still very, very challenging for services. We've interviewed teachers on that, and the sentiment we get back from teachers is, you know, they really appreciate getting the pay parity, but they just wish that it could have been delivered in a way that doesn't kind of make it so impossible for their employers, you know. So that's what you kind of expect. It's very reassuring to know and for us to check that that is the kind of sentiment amongst teachers. Although there are teachers too who don't trust that their service is passing things on, so there are issues with it too. Now I won't go too much into what else we're doing, but you know, I hope that you sign up to our mailing list. You fill out a survey form on this webinar if it's been interesting for you. We like hearing from parents. If you do call, make sure to leave your number. There's been a few people who've called and we haven't been able to get back to you. We've got a policy manifesto going out soon. So that's like ECC's wish list of things that governments could do to make things better in ECE. We're working on a fair pay agreement. So that's another big deal. So you know, that thing is hugely disruptive. Some ways good, in other ways bad, because of course, if that leads to higher costs, again, how are we going to pay for it? Sorry to say, until the government has said what they're going to do, that means it will be you guys paying again. You know, if pay goes up, or if conditions, and you can quantify the costs of better conditions, if they get improved, then parents will be paying for that. Like, somebody always has to pay. This is a service. We're going to do one more of these parent sessions, and we'll bring a parent in next time, so there'll be a bit of a dialogue. I think that'll be good. I'm looking forward to it anyway, about some of these issues that we've canvassed. So once again, do send us in some questions. I know I will talk briefly about profit making in ECE, because I always get some questions or comments about that in these sessions. So I'll talk about that a bit, but maybe that would be a good one to give to the panel, well, the parent live webinar coming up. And like I said, please do complete the survey. So I think, yeah, on the profit making in ECE, I think, like I've said in this session, you know, we don't have a public system. There is no state ownership of ECE. It's a regulation and funding arrangement. So at the moment, you could, if you're a legal entity, you could apply to get a license to operate one of these services, but you will have to meet the regulatory requirements to be funded. If you do not, you lose your license. If you don't meet your funding conditions, you lose the money, so you'll be gone. That's the arrangement. So that means that government has kind of two roles. It can set standards through regulations, and it can encourage services to do things through funding. And that's good for you, because when they fund stuff, you get services that, you know, otherwise you wouldn't be able to afford. So that's good. So the question around profit, though, is so deeply nailed into things that it's quite hard to get out. So remember, we looked at a fee schedule from a private and a community-based provider. If you look at the statistics, you'll see that private services have been on the increase for the last couple of decades. Community-based have been relatively static. Those private developers, you know, they buy the land, they build a building, say it's, you know, some of them are pretty expensive, easily, you know, $1 million for a site in Auckland, multi-million for the build. You know, that money comes in privately, it's not funded from the government. So there's a lot of investment going on that you can't really see. But with that investment, the operator needs to be able to pay back that loan, and, you know, the risk that they're going to set that up. So that all is possible through profit margins. Profit, of course, is not a dirty word. If you're running a business, you know, that's your job, right? You've got to be able to make a profit. Otherwise, you know, you're not going to be able to expand. Basically, if you can't make a profit, you are looking at winding up your business. You don't want that either. Just lastly on the profit thing, we've done an OIA to IRD. In the last 7 financial years, for all of the businesses categorized as private, more than half of them returned no income, which means they paid no tax on that. So, you know, over the last 7 years, half of the private providers made no profit to pay tax on. And let's also remember the level of closures, service closures in the last 3 years, so ramping up. If the services were not, like, they're closing at such high rates, that is not a sign of services making, you know, excess profits. It's quite the reverse. It's like, not only can they not make a profit, but they can't even stay sustainable in the next financial period. So look, that's what we know. But again, you know, there's no legal requirement for businesses to report their profit rates. And why do you really want to know? You know, it's a little bit awkward to ask that question. If you are a centre owner and you are working in the business, you know, you would be extracting some of your income from the profit margin. Just like you were if you were running a dairy, or if you had another business, you know, how do you get paid? That's how they get paid, and that's how it works in business in New Zealand. That's basically the law. They're not breaking the law. Why do you feel like you need to know? You know, there's a lot of accountability around the funding they receive and the regulations they have to follow. But where does it get to the stage where you suddenly need to be able to see how much profit they're making? If they charge really high fees that are not reasonable, you will leave that service and go to another one. The system is designed that way. So, you know, you can vote with your feet if you think it's unfair. Do tell them before you leave, so they, you know, hopefully fix it for the other families. But yeah, that's a little bit on profit, but I know it's controversial. But then it would be sad not to mention it in the sessions. I know it's very interesting for people, very keen on the debate being progressed. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've learned something. We really appreciate your time, and apologies for those who saw the glitched session last night. Thank you.